Moccasin Trail, Chapter 13. It took Jim about 5 minutes of blindly furious riding to reach the hidden clearing in the forest. He stopped there, cleared his head with an effort, and flung himself off Buckskin to prepare for what lay ahead of him. Johnny was right about one thing. The cayuses would be up in arms, prowling the ridge. They'd be in an ugly mood, too. Jim didn't care. There was a violence inside him no more to be controlled than a buffalo stampede, and he wasn't trying. The one thing he craved was to plunge headlong into the worst danger he could find. He tore off his clothes with a savage haste, fighting to stave off the memory of Johnny's ashamed apology for him. The faster he got to the ridge, the sooner he'd lose that humiliation in the uproar of battle and escape. The more wounds he got, the less he'd ache from the one Johnny had dealt him. He was stripped to his breech clout now, strapping the tight bundle of discarded clothes to the epichamore just behind where he would sit. There was a chunk of pemmican in his pouch. He chewed it ravenously while he checked his rifle's loading and primed the can. Next, he must tie the medicine bundle behind his braid. In spite of his defiant shout to Johnny, he had no wish to part with his hair just yet. The bundle would turn cayuse bullets as well as Sioux. He reached hurriedly into his pouch for it, frowned, searched again, and then remembered. It was back on the claim, cached in the hollow of the old stump beside the Tualatin. For a moment he felt utterly forsaken. Nobody in his right mind would ride into danger without the protection of his helpers. It was more than reckless. It was foolhardy. The spirits grew angry at such arrogance, and they might take away their power from your medicine. They might desert you forever. Jim dropped to his knees, grim-jawed, and drew a packet of vermilion from his pouch. Never mind the spirits. Never mind anything. He said he would take the mare back where she came from, and he meant to do it. Obstinately, he shoved away a wave of foreboding as he crouched there in the dark, striping his cheeks, his forehead, the bridge of his nose with the paint of defiance. But a moment later, when he pushed through the woods with his rejected gift in the direction of the ridge, his heart sank at the empty feel of his left braid against his shoulder. He was alone indeed. It was not long before he had company of a perilous sort in his wary progress up the rise. To his left he could hear the thrashing of several horses through the underbrush, the angry grunts of their cayuse riders. Ahead of him on the right, another party was approaching with a lack of caution that surprised him. They didn't know he could hear them perfectly, and as long as he did hear them and could stay out of their ahead of him on the right, another party was approaching with a lack of caution that surprised him. Didn't they know he could hear them perfectly? And as long as he did hear them, could stay out of their way? He guided Buckskin and the stolen mare into a thicket and stayed there, a hand clamped over the nostrils of each, while the second party passed so close he could hear the squeak of their saddles. He eluded a third group with the same ease a few minutes later, and had almost gained the ridge before he realized that all the searchers were behind him, fanning out across the wooded slope but moving down it towards the east. He understood then why they were careless of the noise they made. He was in the one spot they wouldn't expect him to be, within a stone's throw of their own camp. He smiled wryly in the dark. Pure rashness had gained him a safety he'd never expected, and wasn't sure he wanted. But the night wasn't over. They must have left sentries at the camp. Things were bound to get lively yet. He moved southward along the ridge, keeping well back from the edge. It was certain now that his escape, if he managed it, would not be to the east, into the arms of those searchers. The gully up which he traveled, driven the cattle, would be a good place to take the mare down. He could leave Buckskin in the thick clump of the pines at the head of it. In another few minutes he was looping her bridle over a pine bough and cocking his ears for sounds of movement in the gully below, and was still, all was still, too still to suit him. It was one thing to steal into that hollow on your own silent moccasins, sure of a swift horse under you when you'd pulled off your coup and didn't mind making a racket. It was quite another to reverse the procedure. Have a horse to encumber you in the beginning, and only your own legs to outrun the pursuit. He took time to muffle the stolen mare's hoofs with chunks of moss tied on with vines. Then he looked at her one last time, glimmering there in the darkness like a phantom horse, proud and gentle and beautiful. Why couldn't Johnny have taken her? What was wrong with her? Just the fact that he'd stolen her from a cayuse? But the cayuse had stolen her from someone else. That was the way you got horses. Besides, the cayuses had no rights under those fancy bourgeois laws. They didn't even belong in this valley. He couldn't understand it. All he knew was that he'd given the best gift he could imagine, and it still wasn't good enough. He led the mare out of the trees and down into the gully. He heard the faint mutter of voices when he was halfway down. They seemed to come from above, to his right. He crept on warily, crouching to get the ridge between him and the sky so he could locate the sentries. Yes, there they were, 2 of them, blacker shapes against the gloom. He hugged the right bank of the gully and moved on. Then the mare's hoof struck a loose pebble. She stumbled. The pebble rolled and dislodged another. The clatter seemed to fill the world. Jim was running before he took conscious thought. There was a thrashing overhead, and 2 shots rang out, splattering on the loose rocks where he had crouched an instant before. He heard grunts, a shout, crackling underbrush. They were racing toward the gully, reloading as they came. He dived beneath the trailing branches of a tree, projecting out of the side of the embankment, and dragged the mare in after him. Clamping a hand over her nose, he waited. Almost immediately, a figure hurtled over the bank a few hundred feet behind him, and another followed. Too far away to aim on a night as dark as this. Jim didn't wait for them to get any closer. He sprang out of his shelter and onto the mare, bringing his heels back against her sides with a force that sent her spurting down the gully in a spray of pebbles. 2 more shots followed him, but he was an uncertain target, dodging and zigzagging and hugging the mare's neck close. Excitement rose up in him. The only course remaining now was the boldest, and it suited his mood exactly. He swung south as soon as he emerged into the hollow, circling its outer edge as fast as the mare could run. Light-colored horses were the hardest to see at night. He had that in his favor, and the hullabaloo that had risen from the lodges covered the beat of the mare's hoofs. Now, if they did what he thought they would. The first cayuses erupted at that moment from the edge of the forest where the camp lay and raced for the loose horses. Jim laughed exultantly under his breath as more streamed out into the hollow. Squaws, young boys, and the few warriors who were not beating the far slope of the ridge, looking for him. By the time 6 men were mounted, he had dived into the woods behind the lodges they had emptied. Branches crashed against him. Vines tangled the mare's feet as she plunged headlong through a maze of trees and thickets. In another instant, he caught a whiff of smoke and swerved toward it, sliding down from her back to pick his way warily now toward the first lodge. In a moment he saw it through the trees, faintly luminous from the cook fire inside. Now was the time for caution. He stole closer, eyes and ears straining, rounded the last tall clump of ferns, and stood with pounding heart at the edge of the tiny open space where the lodge stood. To his right and left and ahead he glimpsed other luminous cones, but all the noise was coming from eastward in the hollow and the mouth of the gully. Swiftly he crossed the open place and tied the mare exactly where he had found her, to the lodge itself. There, by Gore, he thought bitterly, I done what I said I did. I done what I said. He started to run away, then stopped. He had seen a shadow move across the faintly glowing hides of the lodge. Someone was inside it. He leaped for the clump of ferns and felt himself suddenly outlined in yellow radiance as the lower flap of the lodge was yanked up and the firelight streamed out. At the same moment, a screech split the silence as someone scrambled under the flap, yelling in a dozen different keys. It was a squaw from the pitch of her voice, but Jim didn't wait to find out. He was already dodging through the tangled woods, hearing an answering shout from the direction of the hollow, and the thud of hoofbeats as the searchers in the gully turned back to race toward this new alarm. He'd have to use his wits now and fast. He couldn't get to Buckskin without running head on into his pursuers, or else ranging in a wide circle to avoid them. There simply wasn't time for circling. He couldn't outrun their horses. Instinctively, he doubled backwards on his own tracks, heading straight for the lodge again. The hoofbeats were thunderous now. As he glimpsed the lodge, he heard the first cayuses break into the woods behind him. The squaw was still standing beside the tethered mare, chattering excitedly to two others who had appeared beside her. Jim gave them a wide berth, slipped through the perilously thin fringe of trees between them and the next firelit cone, melted into the black shadow behind the third, and paused to gasp for breath. He could hear a small child wailing on the other side of the stretched hides, not a foot away from him. The sound faded as he set off again, darting from lodge to lodge in a northeasterly direction. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit were growing vaguer as the cayuses thrashed through the forest he had just quitted. But it wouldn't last long. He swerved abruptly, due east, passed behind the last lodge, and broke out of the trees into the open hollow. He was almost across it, running like the wind, when a shout rang out from the edge of the forest. They'd spotted him. It was all up now. The gully looked a mile away. He had time to curse himself for his own obstinate insistence on tying the mare exactly where he'd got her, instead of simply sending her down the gully with a spank and getting out fast. And then he was in the gully. The first bullets ricocheted off the side of it. He flung himself into the vines that trailed down the embankment and began scrambling up them. He had almost reached the top when the cayuses burst into the lower end of the gully. He froze to immobility, his fingers and moccasins dug into the vines and crumbling dirt, his cheeks smashed against the rough, twiggy stems. The smell of sweat and earth and vermilion was in his nostrils as he clung there, fighting for breath. They could either spot him and pick him off as easily as shooting a blackbird off the limb, or they could fail to see him and race on up the gully. They raced up the gully, yelling vengeance. In an instant, Jim had gained the top of the bank and was streaking through the tangle of underbrush to the clump of pines where Buckskin, the spirits willing, was still waiting. Once he was on horseback, the odds would be evened. He could fight like a warrior instead of dodging and hiding like a fox chased by dogs. He reached her just as the first cayuse and emerged from the top of the gully, yanked free her halter, and flung himself with wild elation on her back. A rear and a plunge, and she was streaking south, and the world was transformed into a confusion of yells and whining bullets and wind streaming through his braids. He felt a blow on his right shoulder and a ripping pain. Twisted on the apishimore with a screech of defiance, he leveled his own rifle. He could see nothing but moving dark blurs behind him, but heard a fresh confusion following his shot, and took advantage of it to swing eastward and then south again in a broad zigzag. Their aim was bad now, and he was outdistancing most of them, for Buckskin was comparatively fresh, and their horses jaded from the chase he had led them. But there was one he couldn't lose. There was always one you couldn't lose. He swerved in and out between scattered thickets and the patches of pine that dotted the long ridge, and the hoofbeats behind gained steadily. He fired at the sound at last, as fast as he could load and reload. But they only thudded louder, while cayuse bullets buzzed closer and closer to his own head. The Indian ran out of ammunition at last, but the flame in Jim's shoulder was hampering his own movements, and he had only time for one more shot, which hit he could hear the cayuse grunt before he felt the jarring impact of another horse against his own, and an arm like steel encircled him, striving to drag him from Buckskin's back. He clung hard with his knees, twisting and struggling, striking out savagely with the butt of his rifle, hearing the rasping breath of the two beasts and the cayuse mingling with his own. A new flame from a knife wound ripped across his cheek, and the smell of blood rose strong through the smell of sweat and horses. He found his own knife at last and grasped at slippery flesh and struck hard, twice. Coarse hair scraped his shoulder as the cayuse sagged against him. He shoved at the weight, twisted violently, and tore loose at last from the suffocating embrace. Then he and Buckskin were in motion again, plunging across a shallow ravine and up the side, and running, flying, south and eastward down through the hills, and this time no hoofbeats echoed behind him. He never knew how much later it was he slid down Buckskin's heaving side and dropped full length beside a stream. He groped toward the water, whose bell-like murmur he could hear in the darkness. The moss was cool and wet under his aching body, and the water an icy shock when he plunged both arms into it. He drank deeply, then lay there, dragging air into his lungs, feeling the pain dance along the side of his cheek like flames and his shoulder burn like a coal. Gradually, the tumult of the last few hours faded from his brain, and the thudding of his heart began to sound like voices. "You can't do that. It ain't right. By golly, all this trouble to get around, riling them devils. Making thieves of all of us. Trouble in the valley. Kill one cayuse. Trouble in the valley." He sat up painfully, staring into the velvety darkness. Would dawn find livestock slaughtered, a cabin in flames, a settler lying bloody and still in the mud of his own dooryard? Then he remembered the squaw and sagged all over with relief. She'd seen him clearly in that instant of discovery behind the teepee. When he'd stood flooded with yellow light, she'd be able to swear to his feather and paint, his naked body. No white man would ever be suspected of any part of this night's work. He drew a long, ragged breath and ran his fingers through the tangled lock that hung over his forehead. It was sweat-drenched, clotted with blood and paint. He felt that way all through inside him. Bewildered, he tried to summon pride in his recent coup, gain some satisfaction from the hullabaloo of danger and violence and escape he had finally stirred up after craving it for weeks. But he could not forget Rutledge's stern eyes, which once, back at the Dalles, had looked at him so gently in the moment of his deep humiliation. He could not forget Johnny's shamed excuses for him, or the faces of those men. But why? Why couldn't he? The question loomed up, grew, and spread until it filled his mind. He was totally unskilled at finding the answer, for he had never before asked such a thing of himself. He sat down, probing and floundering, trying to understand. Gradually, the outer world faded from his consciousness, as, for the first time in his life, one part of Jim Keith stood off and scrutinized the other. It was a curious experience, a little frightening. He had a clear sensation of slipping out of himself, then turning back to look. And there he was, sitting alone in the dark with his head in his hands, aching and sore from a night of blundering mistakes, too stubborn to admit how wrong he'd been. "You fool," he thought. "It ain't coups you care about. It's what them men think of you. It ain't enemies you want. It's friends." Without knowing it, he'd outgrown this sort of life. He'd changed. Slowly, but inescapably, the thought completed itself. No longer was he Tox alone, the son of Scalp Necklace. He was Johnny Keith's brother, and a white man. It was time to act like one. He sat a long time thinking about it. At last he rose stiffly to his feet. With the first motion he was again vividly aware of the darkness, the bell-like rush of the stream, the chill breath of the night air against his sore flesh. He moved across moist and spongy moss into icy water and stood there knee-deep, splashing away the grime and paint and dried blood he could feel but not see, while that busy corner of his brain automatically analyzed the mingled smells of horseflesh, earth, and fir trees. He was not thinking now, not peering inward at himself in that unaccustomed way. He didn't need to. He waded to the bank, unstrapped his clothes from Buckskin's back, and dressed himself, shivering. A short while afterward he was riding down out of the hills and into the broad and sleeping valley. The violence of the night seemed far behind as he looked out across the lowlands, dim and mist swirled with approaching dawn. Green pastures, still waters, Johnny's valley, my valley, he thought experimentally. In spite of himself, his eyes moved eastward, where the mountains lay hidden and snow-locked under the banks of the cloud. But it was south to the Tualatin he turned his mare.